So we'll wait for this to get going here. Now here's the thing I don't know about streaming with YouTube is I'm not sure how much of me just standing here while that was getting ready actually shows up, because I do think it has the delay. So who knows? The people watching the recording may have just seen me standing there, or if they tune in right away. But welcome everyone who's on the recording and those who will be on the live stream in a little bit here. We are approaching, I say approaching, we are at the end of, at least in an hour and a half or so, we'll be at the end of this class, the history of Lutheranism, 5 centuries of Lutheranism, what have you. As was true last week, will kind of remain true this week, that as we move into the 20th century, we are in large part not looking at an enormous amount of stuff that is happening in the Lutheran world, especially in the 20th century. We can get bogged down in the world wars really fast. And the world wars are going to come up, right? I mean, they were significant enough that really nothing in the early half of the 20th century was not affected by the world wars. But we're still going to kind of focus on the LCMS. What was happening with the LCMS, what was going on with the LCMS, and what was happening in American Lutheranism. But really in the LCMS in the 20th century. And quite frankly, mostly through the first 2/3 of the 20th century. I've mentioned to a number of folks that this is the kind of history I don't like doing for 2 reasons. Like this era of history. One is it's way too recent and not that interesting to me. Right? I mean, as soon as there's electronics and gunpowder and stuff like that, my interest starts to wane. In fact, we will have, if I can get it to work, we will actually look at a newsreel before we're done with this today. And it took a while for it to occur to me that there's film of some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, because I never do this era of history. And additionally, some of you might remember some of this stuff. It depends on how integrated into the LCMS in the 60s and 70s you were. But and there are pros and cons of doing, I guess, what you call living history that is in the lived memories of individuals. The pro is you can get firsthand accounts, and primary sources are always good. They're always helpful, they're always useful. And that's why things like the Library of Congress and all the work they're doing for just getting people to archive their life. Like, they don't actually care what you lived through or who you are, but just tell us your life story, because it might be useful later on, right? So that's good. Primary sources, people who lived through the events. The other side of that is because people have lived through these events, what can happen is you have your own particular view, which may or may not have included the whole picture, and your view might be wrong about what at least generally is going on. Now, of course, the way you're reacting to history, the way you're seeing things is still relevant and meaningful, but it might be that other things were happening that you're unaware of. And for what it's worth, that goes for us living in this moment now. There are things going on in this world that we have our opinions and thoughts on, and we might be wrong about those things simply because we don't have the whole story, right? That's the nice thing about going hundreds and hundreds of years back, is not always, but a lot of times we have a much fuller picture of what was going on, or at least we have the, as you say, the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of it not being personal, right? We don't have to get upset when the English and the French are fighting each other in the 100 Years' War, because we don't have patriotic feelings or anything about that. So kind of the emotional side of things kind of goes away. So pros and cons, and I think especially with what we're going to be covering today, there are a number of folks, especially here, and you go and talk to people who've been in the LCMS for a while, and they will be able to tell you their side of what was going on. And go ahead and do that. I jokingly was telling the ladies in the office today that I was trying to figure out a way to carefully craft a series of questions to just force Pastor Lecky to teach this class for me. Just ask a question and let him tell it, right? Because he lived through a lot of this and was very involved. He was not in seminary yet through most of this, but he has a very particular perspective on this. But he's not going to be here tonight. So,
is he okay?
They're at a birthday party of one of their grandchildren. So, so it's a good thing I didn't plan on just passing the torch, as it were, over to Pastor Blakey. But the 20th century. Where we kind of left off with the LCMS was really we looked at the founding of the LCMS and kind of just let the latter portion, like the latter third or so of the 19th century kind of just play itself out. We looked at kind of some statistics right at the end of the century. But mostly the LCMS at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century is truly still a German synod. Right, we talked about that with the exclusion, if you will, of the English, what is now the English district, simply on the basis of language. You speak English, we speak German. We can get along, but we can't be together, at least not in that synodical sense. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, that's beginning to change. It is still the LCMS, and it is still a huge part of the DNA of the LCMS is that we are a German, really largely a German immigrant synod, but that identity is starting to fade for a number of reasons. One, well, as time goes on, you have fewer and fewer people who were from Germany or who had lived in Germany. I can't remember, I probably should have looked up how many presidents it took for us synodically to have the first president that wasn't born in Germany, that was born in the United States. So it was 4 or 5. It took us a little while to get there, but it did happen. And granted, they were still their son, or well, in this case of presidents, they're still sons. But the members of many LCMS congregations are still children, mostly of German immigrants. But they're second generation children, third generation. They're starting to distance time-wise from the homeland. As it were. Additionally, the LCMS is doing mission work. It's trying to bring other people in. And while they would still do a lot of teaching German to people or groups that were coming in, it's a lot easier to change the identity and the culture if you have different ethnic groups in particular coming in that they don't really have any formal attachment to German other than the person who converted to Christianity speaks German and is teaching me German. And so even at the very outset of the 20th century, German is starting to get phased out, but we'll note it's mostly at the lay level. So the lay people more and more are not speaking German. Or speaking less and less German. German's becoming, well, I only speak German at church, this sort of thing, because the pastors, the clergy, the educated, the higher ups, they're all still doing everything in German. And when they're not doing it in German, they're doing it in Latin. Go ahead.
So around 1900, the hymnal would have been in German?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When would the hymnal probably have changed language?
World War I.
We're going to get to that. I mean, basically, it was a very gradual change. It was not all at once, and it was district by district. I started to look into, well, when was the actual date that the LCMS officially went to English, and the closest thing I could find was a 180-page dissertation on the transition from German to English in German congregations. And I thought, I'm not reading this. And so I skimmed through it, and it wasn't terribly helpful. Probably had the answer buried in there somewhere. But for that statistic, I didn't care enough. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I used to work for the Aid Association of Lutherans, and all their materials were in German up until somewhere between World War I and World War II.
Right, and we'll kind of get there, but that's kind of, for the most part, when it happens, between the two world wars. At least on the official level. Like I said, on the lay level, it's starting to transition earlier. But so like in, I used to know this. I want to say it's like in the 19-teens, the current seminary was founded. The current seminary in St. Louis was founded. Now, there was a different location. It was on Jefferson Avenue previously. Now it's on Clayton Avenue. well, it's not Seminary Place is the name of the road it's technically on, but it's off Clayton Avenue. And it was in the 19-teens when it was dedicated and classes transitioned there. And there's actually a really interesting plaque above the dining hall in the courtyard in between Isolation Dorm, is what we called it, and the dining hall. It's called ISO Dorm because it's the only original building that wasn't attached to another building. And back during the Spanish influenza, that's where they put all the sick people. So that if you were healthy, you were in the main dorms. If you were sick, you went to ISO. That, by the way, is where I stayed when I was living on campus. I was in ISO dorm, right next to my bed and the laundry door shared a wall. I should have moved the bed. It was a poor choice. But that was the courtyard where they had the commencement speech founding the seminary and all of that. And they have a plaque commemorating it because the speech was in Latin because that was the language of academia. And during it, a biplane flew overhead. And so it's kind of this weird old world meets new world moment because it was built with horse and wagons. Were carrying the bricks. It's fascinating how the seminary really is kind of this old world meets new world sort of moment. But classes were in Latin and German at that time, and they're going to start to transition. What was it? It was the 1904 World's Fair was in St. Louis.
Yeah.
So it was the seminary was founded a few years after that. So yeah, probably the 19-teens.
That's where they invented the hot dog and the ice cream.
Ice cream cone, the waffle cone.
Judy
Yep.
Garland had a great time there.
And there are steam tunnels under the seminary that go out into Forest Park that predate the seminary, but you can still get in them every once in a while. They're mostly used to store chairs now. These dirt tunnels that were built before the World's Fair. So here we are. I'm getting ahead of myself, but basically, the LCMS at the outset of the 20th century is still a very German immigrant synod that is transitioning out of that. So it's kind of in a state of transition. Now, what is going to really kick this transition into overdrive? Well, it is the world wars. But we really do want to take them each in turn because in large part, World War I was far more significant in the transition, and World War II kind of just sealed the deal. And so in the early 20th century, you did have the rise, particularly with World War I, of anti-German sentiment in the United States. This was largely, well, it escalated significantly once the U.S. entered into World War I, right? Because you're fighting the Germans, and so it was popular to hate the Germans, right? It's kind of just how these things tend to go. But what really kicks off anti-German sentiment in the 20th century is this thing known as the Zimmermann telegram, which is this fascinating oddity of history. So in January of 1917, so World War I, I don't know the dates, it's 1914 to 1918, right? Of course, ending on Armistice Day, 11/11 and 11/11, right?
Yeah,
so November 11th, yeah. So in 1917, so we're in the stage of World War I where no one is going to win, but no one can back down because they can't lose that badly. So I mentioned this with the 30 Years' War, right? At this point in World War I, everyone's trying to lose the least. Quagmires are everywhere. No one can really do anything, right? This is the, what's the price of a mile sort of thing. And it's like, 1 mile is 2.5 million lives or something ridiculous like that. For every inch of ground gained, 100 people died. This kind of stuff. Imagine just think to yourself for a moment how bad World War I was, and it was about 100 times worse than that. World War I was an absolutely horrifying conflict. We were talking a little bit about World War II and how much no one wanted to go to war, which is why Hitler was able to expand as much as he was, because everyone said never again. And, well, it did happen again, but not quite the same way. Anyway, so we're in January of 1917. No one can win. Everyone's trying to find a way to get enough of an advantage to win at the negotiating table. right? Not to take victory, but to lose the least at the negotiating table. Well, one of these, and we have all sorts of kind of wacko ideas that go out around this time. This is when the tank gets invented to try and break the stalemate on the trenches. By the way, that was one of the things that actually did cause the end of the war. But these people are trying everything. Aerial warfare is becoming a thing, right? Zeppelins are just literally, guys were pushing bombs off the sides of Zeppelins. Just trying everything to kind of crack the stalemate of World War I. Well, diplomacy was another one of these, and one of these kind of off-the-wall ideas that someone in German high command had was to send a telegram to Mexico. Now, background, the U.S. is kind of indicating that it's going to enter the war, that it's looking for an excuse to enter the war at this point. Germany is aware of this, right? Everyone knows the U.S. entered the war. I don't know if everyone knows this. I know this. That the U.S. entered World War I because of the sinking of the Lusitania, right? German U-boats sunk a passenger ship, which definitely didn't have arms, armor, and supplies for the Entente forces, right? Because the Allies in World War I were the Germans, the Austrians, and them. Which is why the Lusitania exploded almost like it was full of explosives when a German U-boat accidentally misidentified and shot it, right? The Lusitania was an excuse. The U.S. was ready to enter the war. They just needed a reason to enter the war. And so the Germans are kind of aware of this, and they know that the U.S. will break the balance because everyone else is just exhausted, and you have millions and millions of more troops. It's nothing to do with, American exceptionalism. It's we had millions of people that we could throw at machine guns and trenches that the European countries didn't have anymore because they already did. And so Germany really did not want the U.S. to get involved. Or, if the U.S. was going to get involved, they wanted a contingency. So, the Germans sent a telegram, known as the Zimmermann telegram, to the Mexican government, saying, hey, hypothetically, if the U.S. enters the war, it would be cool, hypothetically speaking, if you invaded the United States. And perhaps we could work out a deal where you would get Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico in the final treaty if you were to invade the United States. This is is more off the wall than you think, because Mexico at the time was in the middle of something called the Mexican Revolution, which is like in its 20th year of civil war. So even if the Mexican government thought this was an interesting proposition, they were in no position to invade, because if the army goes to invade, then the other army is going to wipe out. They were in their own quagmire of war, so they couldn't. It wasn't a real possibility. In fact, there's a possibility that the Germans sent the Japanese a similar telegram, which is really off the wall because the Japanese were fighting Germany at the time. Again, this is kind of the wildness of World War I. Well, the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by British intelligence, which made it public to the United States. Wonder why, right? The Zimmermann telegram, by the way, is one of the real reasons why the United States does get involved, right? You're going to come after us, we're going to get you first, sort of idea. But the Zimmermann telegram, so January of 1917, when it became public, the public went hard against the Germans. And so there was a rise in the anti-German sentiment. People who spoke German and had family ties to Germany were viewed as spies, agents, saboteurs, all of those sorts of things, right? The fifth column, as it were, inside the United States, that Germany was just waiting to activate to overthrow the United States, right? Completely ridiculous and insane, and we've never seen anything like this ever happen in American history before or since, other than every time the United States is at war. But that was kind of what was going on. And the anti-German sentiment went so far as to have mobs firebombing churches, Lutheran churches. In fact, one of the churches I served in St. Louis, they have, for their 100th anniversary, they commissioned a tapestry of their church's history. And up in one corner, there's a church that's on fire. And I was asking the pastor, I was looking at it, I'm thinking, I said, oh, did the church have a fire? And he said, well, yeah. That's when someone threw a Molotov cocktail through the window because they were German. They were evil, right? And I was like, oh, that's right. You were around during that period of history. And so, how do you prove that you're not a German fifth column? Well, you stop speaking German. You stop forcing everything to be in German, among other things. All sorts of things of this nature. The German congregations did as much as they could to prove that they were patriotic Americans and not a German fifth column. This sentiment continues during World War II of anti-German sentiment. That kind of any of the straggler churches that were still speaking English or still speaking German transitioned during World War II. But by and large, some point in between the wars, basically all of the LCMS converted from German into English. Of course, German was still widely used. Pastor Leckie mentioned how for him to get a doctorate, he would have needed to pass German. I had classmates who were taking German. So it's not gone even today, but as time goes on, it becomes less and less relevant. So even before World War I, the Synod was moving that direction, but by the end of World War I, most of the districts had officially adopted English as their language, and by World War II, by the end of World War II, all had. Questions there? It's kind of a bit of a transition point here.
We think that's silly that you have to know German. Get your
I mean, that's kind of how academia is. When I was in undergrad, I needed to take a foreign language as part of the history program, and I signed up for Hebrew. I was getting ready to go to seminary, and I was like, well, it's modern Hebrew, not biblical. And I got called into an academic advisor's office who said, no, you're not allowed to take Hebrew. I said, why? He said, you're in a history program, you need to take French. because of all the Napoleon era historians were writing in French. It didn't matter where they were from. In the 1800s, history was done in French. And I told him, I said, no. I'm going to be a pastor. My graduate studies require me to learn Hebrew. And even if I don't become a pastor, I'm going into Hebrew history, or the history of Israel and that sort of thing. And he kind of said, okay. So I thought you were just doing it just because. And like I said, I had to explain myself to an advisor because I wasn't taking French as a history student. I mean, this is not long ago. Academia is kind of weird like that. But yeah, right. Have you ever heard how the French language counts? It's an absolute nightmare. It's like 6/20s is how or 3/20s is how they say 60. It's ridiculous. Anyway, that's
French was for the aristocracy and German was for the working peasants.
There you go. Yeah.
A long time ago.
Yes. Yes, it was.
So German's easier to learn too, and I explore the French.
Not English.
That's right. Everything's in English. The lingua franca. But so after the World Wars, particularly World War I, at least as far as our story, Germany, along with all of Europe, but particularly Germany, was absolutely in ruins. It was just a smoking, ruinous shell of its former self, right? Which, as I kind of quipped earlier, I don't know if that was on the camera or not, is why the Great Depression happened. It wasn't the stock market crash in the United States. That's what kicked it off over here. But what caused that is the fact that Germany was absolutely decimated, along with a few other factors. But Germany was utterly destroyed, and they really had no way to rebuild themselves because of the treaty. And so the LCMS found themselves and saw themselves as being in a position to aid Germany in rebuilding, reconstruction, and recovery. And so we sent work teams and missionaries and theologians over, kind of expecting to find an empty husk of not only Germany, but also Lutheranism in Germany, because that's what we as the LCMS fled was the kind of overthrow of traditional confessional Lutheranism and kind of higher criticism and ecumenism taking over. And so we were expecting to go over there, fix all the buildings, and school all the Germans. Well, we helped with the fixing of the buildings, but what basically happened is once we sent the theologians over there to various conferences that were occurring, we found out that the LCMS was basically a theological backwater. We were a whole bunch of backwoods fools who didn't know anything, and we didn't like that. That was not something that we enjoyed. And so in the following years with these conferences, we sent a lot of people over to learn from the Germans. In fact, there was just to kind of show the good old LCMS, and I think that the character is still there. I remember all the details, but basically these two guys were sent over to Germany from the seminary with, let's say, $1,000, a lot of money, in order to purchase books to bring back and to build out the seminary's library. Well, they spent almost all of their money on the Weimar edition of Luther's works, which is in German, and we already had a copy. So the library at the seminary for a while was basically 2 copies of Luther's works, and that was kind of it. I can't imagine how that conversation went, because people were not pleased. They were supposed to go get new books, not new copies of books that we already had. And so the LCMS, following World War I and even into World War II, began to invest heavily in kind of theological study and engagement on the Lutheran world stage. You can definitely see evidence of this. I could see it when I was at the seminary, right? There's a cultural desire in the LCMS for us to be academically rigorous and elite on the world stage. Now, this was an extreme. We're going to find out that this is kind of the root of all the problems that were going to come, because we were learning from the German theologians, but we were learning without discretion from the German theologians, and rationalism was alive and well in German Lutheran theology, particularly higher criticism. Now, we briefly talked about higher criticism 2 classes ago when we looked at the Enlightenment, because that's where higher criticism comes from. But basically what higher criticism is this idea that human reason triumphs over the Word of God. So if something does not make sense, in the Bible, in other things too, but in the Bible in particular, then human reason and the science of higher criticism, and credit where it's due, it is a science. It's very helpful in the historical context, but it's not in biblical context, right? So this is the sort of thing, you hear elements of this even today. This is the sort of thing where, kind of probably one of the simplest is the denial of prophecy, right? Humans don't know the future, right? This is something we just know. Therefore, nothing in the Bible that predicts future events could have been written until those future events. The primary place you see this discussed is in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel talks about the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the fall of the Persian Empire, the fall of Alexander the Great, at least in the way that most people read this, and I think it's accurate. And so what higher or historical criticism does is it looks at that and says, okay, Daniel could not have been written until after the fall of Alexander the Great in the intertestamental period, and for whatever reason, and they give reasons, it was written during that intertestamental period and placed into the mouth of a character that was invented that lived during the early Babylonian captivity. That's kind of that's a fairly simple, less dramatic version, but you'll probably also hear this in, I mentioned it to someone in the office today, and they immediately clicked back, well, everyone knows you can't live in the belly of a fish for 3 days, right? And it's like, okay, it's that sort of thing, right? And as our good friend Ken Ham likes to say, once you start removing biblical inerrancy in one place, it does become a domino effect over time, and all of a sudden, all of the meat of the Bible falls apart. For what it's worth, like I said, that's the negative side. And in theology, historical higher criticism is super bad. But in the historical sense, it is very helpful. It is not uncommon for historians of antiquity to write in the mouth of someone from before their time. And so in things like antiquities of history, it's a helpful sort of thing to kind of say, okay, who was actually writing this, and why are they doing this, and what's going on, and that sort of thing. So higher criticism is not wholesale evil. It's just not good when you bring it into the church. It doesn't belong there. It's a tool. It's the wrong tool for the wrong job, sort of thing. So let's see. Right. In short, the LCMS theologians were exposed to, and in large part, kind of ate up, if you will, accepted higher criticism, this idea that human reason should administer over the Scriptures. Now, I'm going to add this in here, just a brief conversation. Something that we call, it's a distinction that we make about the use of reason while reading the Bible. Because despite what some people nowadays claim, we don't want you to read the Bible with an empty head, right? We want you to engage your human reason and your thoughts and your brain and all of that when reading the Bible, but we want to do it in the proper order. And so what we say is there are two ways that you can engage reason in the reading and interpretation of the Scripture. One is the magisterial use of reason, the other is ministerial use of reason. Magisterial use of reason means when something in the Bible and something logically in your brain disagree, your brain wins. It has majesty, right? It rules over the text. Ministerial use of reason is the opposite. When your brain says no one could live in the belly of a fish for 3 days, and you read the text wins the argument, and you can do one of two things. You can say, oh, well, it's just a miracle. God kept Jonah alive in the belly of the fish. Or you can do what I do and say, Jonah died and was resurrected 3 days later. But that's me doing Sign of Jonah stuff. I think you were around for my Jonah class. If not, it's on the YouTube page, so watch that. And you can hear all my thoughts about Jonah chapter 2. But either way, you see the difference. The magisterial use of reason says, human cannot live in whale, therefore this is made up. It might be an allegory, it might be a metaphor, it's a story that someone wrote, it's a fairy tale sort of thing. They wanted to do something with it, and the author wants you to learn something, but it didn't really happen. Ministerial use of reason says that doesn't happen, so God intervened in some way, right? And so God kind of wins in that case. And I mean, eventually, the long-term problem of magisterial use of reason is people don't rise from the dead. Jesus can't rise from the dead, right? And then we run into Paul. If Christ is not raised, your faith is in vain. So that's where this eventually goes to. But you can see, quite frankly, in contemporary events, a lot of church bodies are kind of undergoing what we did in the 60s and 70s now, where they're doing it from a slightly different direction through social issues, but you're seeing, right, the Baptist church, the Methodist church, the Anglican church, I don't know if the Episcopal church, I'm just not certain. All of them are getting ready to split, where between the conservative and the liberal theological camps, right, not political, conservative and liberal, and in large part, maybe this is Lutheran centralism or LCMS centrism, but it's the same issue that we were dealing with. We just dealt with it from a exegetical perspective, interpretation of the Bible, and now it's being dealt with from a social perspective or practical theology, if you will. But it's the same sort of thing, and you can see that difference in what gets talked about the fissure between the ELCA and the LCMS. And in that case, yeah, you can definitely see. I mean, you look back at the previous ELCA synodical convention, which I'm sure you're all going to run home and go watch all the transcripts of, and you can see that's kind of the direction that it's gone. Pastor Jordan has a story where he was talking to an LCMS pastor, and he said, or an ELCA pastor, discovered he was LCMS and said, "Oh, you don't actually believe Jesus rose from the dead, do you?" Or, right, he said, "You're one of those who actually believes that," right? It was very, with derision.
Did he slap him?
No, I don't think he did. He probably wanted to. He was basically like, "Yeah, I really do."
So wait, what did he think?
The ELCA guy,
Yeah.
he thought it was all just a story that was made up, and it was meant to teach us lessons and that sort of thing.
His part of what it
What's
was.
this all?
Now, for what it's worth, and we're going to get there later, but not all ELCA Lutherans, pastors, what have you, are theologically liberal. Because of the events we're going to talk about in a minute here, there are a shrinking number of LCMS pastors, or ELCA pastors, who are ELCA because they don't like synodical oversight. And we're going to get to, and you'll see why they don't like synodical oversight as we go on here. And so there are a number of ELCA pastors who are in the ELCA who believe exactly the way the LCMS believes, but they don't like the politics of the LCMS, basically. And I said it's shrinking. It's shrinking. Well, it's shrinking partly because the ELCA's synodical politics are starting to push and force the pastors and the churches into certain positions, and a number of these churches are saying, "We're here because we don't like when Synod tells us what to do, and so if you're going to tell us what to do, we're out." And actually, the ELCA is, especially since the last convention, has lost a number of churches that are now just like free-floating Lutheran churches with no synodical ties or associations. Right, and that's ongoing. They have officially decided to split. Now they're working out the details. Which, to be fair, if you're going to have, in our terms, a synodical split, they're doing it in a much better way than we did. Ours was dramatic and had a lot of tensions and bad feelings. And at the very least, they're kind of parting ways somewhat amicably and saying, "We just can't agree. We just need to go our separate ways."
There's already been lawsuits though because
one side owns the building and one side has all the people inside.
They're taking a vote now.
Yeah.
To decide each church can take a vote, and they're going to get their.
Oh, I'm not saying it's not messy. I'm just saying ours was messier. Basically.
Well, that's a big step though. They weren't that way in the beginning. They said we're taking them all, and the church did.
Yeah. But, all right, where are we? Okay. We have two more documents that we need to deal with in the progression here. In 1932, so this is in between the two wars, the LCMS is recognizing what is happening with the theological upstarts. Let's put it that way. They're recognizing these trends that are coming back from Germany, higher criticism, historical criticism, rationalism, all of that kind of thing. And in 1932, the LCMS releases a doctrinal confession known as the Brief Statement, which is actually fairly brief. Like, I know, shocking. Now, the next document I'm going to reference is even shorter, but holy cow, right? We actually wrote something that wasn't 1,000 pages long, right? So there's the Brief Statement. You can go read it. It reads a lot like the Augsburg Confession because it's intended to. It is 45 paragraphs concerning 19 topics. So it's basically 19 articles with a varying number of topics, ranging from the big one that still is probably the most culturally relevant statement today or article is on creation. It's why it's a little bit controversial, but we'll kind of get very briefly to that. So from what we believe about God, what we believe about church fellowship, to creation, to all of those sorts of things. The Brief Statement sought to place the LCMS in a firmly confessional, kind of historic, Lutheran, Orthodox, all of that stance, and entrenched that stance through confessional subscription and vows of ordination. Now, what is contained in the brief statement, now it's been, I read it my second year of seminary, so it's been a long time. What is in the brief statement is largely what the LCMS just and most LCMS pastors and theologians believe. However, that last part was extremely controversial. So basically what this is in the 30s, the LCMS put the brief statement out and said, we are placing this statement on par with the Book of Concord. Basically, to be a Lutheran, you must also believe in everything that the brief statement says. What did the LCMS decide? Like I said, this is controversial. There's a fight over this. Any of you know which way the fight went in the LCMS? Any guesses?
You mean in the 70s?
No, in the 30s. So the LCMS, we had one camp that said we want to make the brief statement on par with the Book of Concord, and another camp that said absolutely not.
That was
Which
the
one
first
won?
split?
No, it wasn't a split.
Yes.
I would say we kept it.
We have it, but it is not a binding doctrinal
The
statement.
answer is yes.
No, the answer is no. But the way you phrased it.
What was the question again?
The question is, did we make the brief statement a confession on par with the confessions, with the Book of Concord? The answer is no. So the brief statements still exist. The fuller title is something like a brief statement of the doctrinal position and confession of the LCMS or something like that. By the way, this is also like 2 years after the LCMS named itself the LCMS, and it wasn't the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, right? So it's one of these early documents that actually says LCMS on it. So it still exists, but it is not required confessional subscription. So when I was ordained, when I was installed, there was no mention of the brief statement, because I'm not required to believe the brief statement. I'm not required to agree with the brief statement. This is actually coming up again in a really dumb way, but it's coming up and has in the past couple of months. And I'm going to talk extremely briefly about this. If you want more details, you can talk to me later, and I will tell you because I am interacting with this in a very small way. A couple months ago, the LCMS, or CPH, released an annotated edition of the Large Catechism with essays. I made an offhand reference to we actually wrote something that was short, not 1,000 pages long. This is a edition of the Large Catechism that's 700 pages long. So not quite 1,000, but it's pretty darn close. The very brief version of this is some guy in Oklahoma got upset about some of the things that were written in this, in the essay portion, where a large portion of the book is essays on the topics of the Large Catechism, and caused a huge stink. He actually, I've listened to it, he gets on a podcast and talks about how this is the slippery slope of liberal theology into the LCMS. I mean, the guy's in college, he doesn't actually have a historical understanding of the LCMS.
But he has access to a podcast.
I know, right? I'm being kind. I'm trying to be kind because I don't have a positive opinion of this.
What is it? Repeat.
But so he is convinced that the large this edition of the Large Catechism is the slippery slope of the LCMS adopting liberal theology, which it just isn't. Like what I've read so far is not liberal theology. He just doesn't like certain.
Did he read it?
He did. You can tell that he read at least a couple of the articles. I don't know if he read the whole thing, but he read certain articles. And his argument is, because the host of this show flat out asked this guy, because I don't think they're LCMS, is the LCMS requiring ordination vows confessional subscription to this book? And he says, well, not yet. But it's written next to the Large Catechism, which is, and that's true, and so it's implied that this will become, and that this is what the LCMS believes. And Pastor Jordan and I were actually sitting in our office listening to this, and we both started laughing. And I also knew this was coming, but even if it wasn't, I said, if we didn't accept the brief statement as confessional, there's no way in the world we're going to accept an annotated copy of the Large Catechism as confessional. It's just not going to happen. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. I think the brief statement's a helpful resource. It's certainly, it's very historically interesting. I had 3 classes in my class on what we're covering today, which is an entire semester at the seminary. Like 3 of the sessions were dedicated to the brief statement. I think I wrote a paper on it too. Couldn't find any of this to help me prep for that, but whatever. It's a very relevant document, but it is not Confessions, nor should it be. I mentioned the creation aspect because that's the one that gets brought up the most. Because there are some LCMS pastors out there who are very vocal that they don't believe in the 7-day creation, and they're still LCMS pastors. And every once in a while people say, well, that violates the brief statement. And then the response is, that's not confessionally binding. So they don't have to accept the brief statement. Whether or not they should believe the way they believe is not technically relevant to the conversation. I think that's a good thing, personally. Not that they disagree with that statement, but that the brief statement is not on par with the Confessions. It doesn't belong there. It has a different function. Same thing with the CTCRs. If you know what those are the Commissions on Theology and Church Relations. They come out every few years. These are the official technical doctrinal positions of the LCMS, and their recommendations for what members and pastors of the LCMS should believe, with arguments for why they should believe this particular way on whatever this issue is, but they're not confessionally binding. If you want to burn every CTCR that has ever been written, you can still be an LCMS pastor in good standing, because they're not confessionally binding, nor should they be. They're very helpful, they're extremely useful. I don't tend to disagree with the CTCR, mostly because those guys are way smarter than me, the people who put those together. But like I said, it came up in the past couple of months, and so there is some relevance there. Right, so the LCMS does still confess the brief statement. However, it's not part of vows, and members and pastors can openly disagree with portions or all of the brief statement. Well, I don't know, they got sections on God that if you disagree with that, you're going to disagree with what the confessions say, right? Because you start with the God's triune and all of that, so you can't disagree with the whole thing. But as far as it is the brief statement, you can disagree with all of it without breaking fellowship with the Synod. So that's 1932. The LCMS sees this higher critical rationalistic trend and tries to kind of nip it in the bud to put a stop to it with the brief statement. In 1945, 44 theologians put forth what is known as the Statement of the 44, because we're really creative. It is briefer than the brief statement, so they could have called it the briefer statement. And it's 13 years after, but it is definitely in response to the brief statement and what comes after that. Very broadly speaking, again, I had another 3 or 4 classes on just the brief, the brief statement is the one we're on. The statement sought a middle ground, if you will, between the confessional camp that was beginning to form in the LCMS and what I'm just going to keep calling the higher critical camp. They probably would not have called themselves that, but it makes it easier for our purposes. Basically, the Statement of the 44 affirmed traditional confessional beliefs while also condemning unchristian behavior and attacks against the higher critics, stating that even with a different theological position, they were still within the bounds of church fellowship. So basically, and again, this is skimming over a lot, 13 years of history and a lot of context, but the Statement of the 44 said, conservative guys, you're right, but don't be jerks in that. More or less. Again, what's the theme of this class? It's more complicated than that, but for our purposes here. Questions as of this point? All right, so we're gonna definitely hit the fast forward button here. So that was 1945, right at the end of World War II, and we're kind of gonna move into the 60s. So we're clipping through quite a bit, but you can kind of see the trend lines going, and that's what we're looking for. For what it's worth, and because I do think it is worth it to keep in the back of our minds as we discuss what happened in the 60s and the 70s, most of the early 70s. It is worth remembering the cultural context of the United States that this is taking place in, right? What's going on in the 60s and the 70s? A lot. Vietnam! Right, Vietnam. And
Don't trust anyone over 30.
don't trust anyone over 30. You got Red Scare stuff going on. Although Red Scare's earlier than that. But McCarthyism is still around. What was that?
Hippies and drugs.
We're not quite in the full-scale hippies and drugs, but there were definitely hippies and drugs involved in this. What was that? Yeah. But there's a lot of distrust of the man, authority figures, and that is definitely playing into what is that cultural influence is working within the events of the 60s and 70s, like I said, late 60s, early 70s, particularly in this conflict, right? So basically, conflict between the confessional and higher critic parties comes to a head in the late 60s, early 70s. And it's something that has been brewing since the 30s, right? Now, I mentioned how when I took this class on this era, they started with the Lutheran Reformation because one of the guys was a Lutheran Reformation professor and he had to put his thing in there, right? And you can definitely trace it earlier, the roots of this, but for my purposes and what I think is practically helpful, we can trace the beginnings of the walkout to the end of World War I and the discourse between the LCMS and the continental German theologians. And then if you need to slap a date on it, you can put the brief statement there as a nice, good, solid, foundational date of kind of when this stuff is starting to actually cause conflict. So it's been brewing for 40, 50 years at this point, and it all explodes in the late 60s, early 70s. Just as another, especially because we're entering living history here, we're going to really hopscotch over the high, important, top of mind sort of goings on of this event. So many of the professors at Concordia Seminary, the one in St. Louis, the one I attended, right, began teaching, particularly in the exegetical department. Again, the exegetical department is the interpretation of Scripture, right? So you got 4 departments at the seminary. You have the exegetical department. That's one that has classes like Exodus and the Torah, Psalms and Psalms and the writings, Isaiah and the prophets, Matthew and the synoptic gospel, stuff like that, where you're basically going down through chunks of the Bible, reading it and interpreting it, learning how to interpret the Bible. You have the systematic department. Those are classes, well, they're systems 1, 2, and 3 because they're boring German categorizing people. This is like our Christology class, right? Where we're going all over the Bible, we're talking about a topic. Then you have the historical department, which is kind of what we're doing right now. And then you have the practical department, which is like, how do you preach? How do you teach? How do you get people to come into the door of your church? That kind of stuff. So the exegetical department is absolutely at the epicenter of the conflict because they are teaching, they're teaching the Bible in a more direct way than any of the other departments. And they have in large part adopted higher critical methods. Now, for what it's worth, it is extremely difficult to actually find out what was being taught in the seminary at this time. What these professors were actually teaching, and that's actually what causes many of the issues. I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. So the professors at the seminary, particularly the exegetical department, are leaning very heavily into the higher critical method, and at the same time, Synod was taking a decidedly conservative and confessional turn, and backing up that turn with aggressive action. We're going to do something about this. There's a problem at the seminary, and we're going to solve that problem. That was the attitude of synod, particularly as we're going to go on. At the epicenter of both of these parties are two individuals that really everything orbits around these two guys. The first is the president of the seminary at the time, who is John Teichin. That is spelled T-E-I-J-E or T-E-I-T-J-E-N. I know, sorry. Word does not like this name at all. T-E-I-T-J-E-N. John is spelled J-O-H-N, right? That one's pretty easy. He was the president of the seminary, fairly newly elected, but that's kind of more nitty-gritty than we're going to get into. His election was a little bit controversial and he was definitely elected to kind of push the higher critical thing. So he does become a poster child, if you will, for this. Also, he was absolutely beloved by the students of the seminary, which is going to be relevant in a bit here. And then the president of the synod, also newly elected, J.A.O. Preuss, or Jacob Preuss the Second, P-R-E-U-S. If you've been in the LCMS long enough, you've probably run into someone with the last name Preuss. I have like 6 books on my shelf that are written by one Preuss or another. It's one of those kind of big names, kind of like Meyer, except there's like 8 Meyer families. Anyway. So we have John Teichin, the president of the seminary, and J.A.O. Preuss the second, or the president of the synod. J.A.O. Their initials. I only know what the J means.
My grandfather's generation, they often had 2 or 3 middle names.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, so, I mean, think it's the F.W. Walther. I mean, a lot of.
In my family's case, they were picking like baptismal pictures.
Oh, okay.
After that.
Interesting.
Oh, I got a name for you.
Oh, yeah?
My great-great-grandfather, Rufus Pinckney Pomeroy Wilkinson.
Wow.
That is a name.
They call him Rip. Hey, Rip. Rip.
There you go.
Rufus Pinckney Pomeroy. Pinckney.
Is that a name or like a last name?
No, it's a name. Pinckney. P-I-N-C-K-N-E-Y.
Anything's a name if you put it on a birth certificate, right?
Exactly.
So in 1969, so when I say 60s, for our purposes, we're coming in right at the end. So in 1969, Teichin was elected as the president of the seminary, indicating that continuing presence of liberal theology or the higher criticism within the faculty. Again, kind of these little side notes. I'm going to use the term liberal and conservative on and off throughout here. We are not talking Republican and Democrat. They are theological terms in this case. I mean, they're also political terms. But,
What do you mean in the context of theology?
Yeah, so in the context of theology, and particularly in the 60s and 70s as far as the LCMS is concerned, the conservative Lutherans were the ones who put the confessions on a high standard. They saw the Bible as the inerrant and inspired Word of God, and those. Well, actually, you can kind of just leave. There's more, but those are really hallmarks. Whereas the liberal theology was far more had rationalism as their influence, higher criticism, and I know it's a real buzzword nowadays, but we're starting to see the influx of something known as the social gospel. So the liberal theologians, kind of like the pietists, right, said, well, it's all well and good up here in our ivory tower for us to know doctrine perfectly, but it doesn't do us any good if we don't help other people. And so that's what social gospel meant at this point, was we need to get the gospel to people. There is more baggage that has been attached onto that phrase by our present day that I am not going to get into because, while this is a history of Lutheranism, we're not going that far. So we're just not going to deal with social gospel in the modern context. But that's kind of roughly what we mean when we say conservative and liberal. So in 1969, Tietjen was elected. 2 months later, Preuss was elected as the synodical president, indicating the synod's desire to have a very conservative theological leaning. And again, Preuss was elected to, not only, but in large part, to deal with the problem of St. Louis, is how it was sometimes referred to, the problem of the seminary. Now again, we don't really know, and even then, it was really hard to tell what was actually being taught in the classrooms, right? It can still be kind of difficult to figure out what's going on in classrooms, and the seminary, right, invites people in, and we have Twitter, we have videos, we record the classes. It can still be difficult to figure out exactly what professors are saying as someone on the outside. Well, without social media and all this recording and all of that kind of stuff, it was very difficult. And so what you had basically was, right, everyone was playing the phone game. You had the conservative students who were saying, oh man, we have these higher critic, non-Christian professors teaching higher criticism and liberal theology, and then potentially, as far as anyone knew, getting blown way out of proportion. And you had the liberal folks saying no, or the more liberal leaning students saying no. They're just teaching the Bible, the love of God, the gospel, and they're completely in line with what Lutherans believe, which early in the 60s, in large part, they were. We'll see that this trend line continues to the point where they are definitely outside, but that takes place after the events we're talking about, but is heading that direction. And so you kind of have a he said, she said sort of situation. So what is actually going on at St. Louis was really hard, especially on the synodical level, to figure out. And so in 1970, so half a year after he was elected, Preuss commissioned the fact-finding committee, which, remember how we talked about how no one trusted the man? You may as well call the man the fact-finding committee, or vice versa. The goal of the fact-finding committee was to identify exactly what was being taught, to figure out what was being taught at the seminary, what was actually, right, because we're in the paranoid era of, the paranoid 60s and 70s, everyone's a secret commie, right, that kind of thing, and what was actually going on. The fact-finding committee was viewed by many students and faculty as a witch hunt, right, a Red Scare era thing. What they would do is they would hold secret interviews with faculty and students in order to, right, ascertain the truth, right, and so they would take students and faculty aside into locked rooms, interview them, and then swear them to secrecy. You will not talk about what happened in here, which is just not a good look, right? We're trying to reveal what's going on, and so we're going to do it behind closed doors in an extremely secretive way. They did not report to Tietjen. They didn't tell Tietjen what they were doing. They didn't tell the Board of Control, which is something that had...
Who pushed them to do that? Who was behind it?
Preuss and the Synod. Well, the district convention, the synodical convention, rather. And so, basically, this fact-finding committee was a very shady organization. One other group that I haven't mentioned yet, that I probably should have mentioned by now, there was, I think it was in the 60s that it was placed over the seminary, something called the Board of Control, which was a number of synodical appointees that were to oversee what was going on in the seminary. This is different than like the board of the seminary and the board of trustees or whatever it is, the board of presidents, that sort of thing, which still exists. I mean, they had a number of interesting meetings, I can tell, because every once in a while, when I had class with the president of the seminary, he'd come and he was like, because he had to go to a meeting with the board. He didn't enjoy that group. So it's different than that. This is a board of control, which again, I mean, the optics on the name kind of tell you what was intended. And it was there to kind of put the seminary, particularly the professors and the faculty and the president in their place, make sure they knew what was going on. This fact-finding committee didn't even report their findings to the Board of Control, at least not initially. This went on for a long, long time, where you had this secret cabal. The way it was viewed by students was you have this secret cabal of higher-ups and cronies sent by Synod that are doing shady backroom interviews and not telling anyone what their reports are, what they're finding. Right? They're a fact-finding committee that's not sharing any of the facts that they're finding, right? And so an enormous amount of tension grew because of this fact-finding committee. Eventually, though, so the way it was seen is that, by critics, is that this was a witch hunt placed over the seminary for the express purpose of ousting professors and teaching, for that matter. Find a way to get rid of these guys because we don't like them. It was basically the impression that everyone was getting. I don't know how true that was. I suspect it was probably more true than we'd like it to be. Basically, if you haven't seen it already, I'm very convinced that no one did the right thing during this chunk of time. It should have been handled in a far better way, and it just was not. You had a lot of tension and aggression, and it's historically rooted, and it's what happened, but no one's the good guy coming out of this. The report that the committee eventually did provide was known as the Blue Book, but it was kept secret. So they made it known, we have our Blue Book, right, which again sounds very Cold War spy era, right, a product of the culture. It was not made available to the public, nor was it made available to the seminary. Right? So this was kind of a behind closed doors for the higher-ups in the Synod. They were the only ones who got to see it. Which again, fact-finding committee is really sowing a lot of unintentionally. Right? I really don't think that the fact-finding committee was founded with the intention of making everyone hate the fact-finding committee. But that's what happened. It was, like I said, it was seen as a shady organization. In February of 1973, so again, this was years that this was happening. In February of 1973, the Board of Control, which had been placed over the seminary, voted 6-5 to commend the faculty of the seminary and uphold their scriptural confession. So the Board of Control in 1973 said, no one on the faculty is doing anything wrong. They believe the Bible. They are upholding everything that we believe and teach in the confessions. They are good. Now, 6-5. So there was definitely some tension there. But the Board of Control did commend the faculty and the president teaching of the seminary. That was in February of 1973. Now, I gave you a month, and I'm sure you can guess why I'm giving you a month, because more stuff happens in 73. Later that year, the summer is typically when these happen, at the New Orleans Convention. So this is the Synodical Convention, right? We got one coming up this summer. Hopefully it's not this exciting. It won't be. We have important work that needs to be done. Not as dramatic as this. So later that year in the summer, at the New Orleans Convention, the faculty of the seminary was condemned by the Synodical Convention for abandoning the doctrine of sola scriptura. So within 6 months, you have one oversight committee that was appointed by Synod, by the way, but a few years back, saying the faculty is good. And then a few months later, you have the Synod in Synodical Convention saying the faculty is condemned. They have abandoned sola scriptura. They've abandoned Scripture alone. At this point, also during this convention, the Board of Control was ousted, and a new, hostile Board of Control was appointed in its place. So basically, Synod said, you guys got it wrong, we're kicking you out, we're putting in guys that are going to get the right answer this time.
That's a big deal.
Who paid for all that?
Oh, this is all synodical stuff. So in August of 1973, the new Board of Control voted to suspend teaching from office and basically to carry out the decision at Synodical Convention officially over the seminary as the Board of Control. It's worth noting that the suspension of teaching was supposed to happen in August at the beginning of the academic year, but it was suspended, or the suspension was delayed until January of 1974. The reason for this was, I forgot his first name.
Jim.
It might be. I think it's Carl, actually. But a extremely highly respected theologian, the last name Peepcorn, died of a heart attack right around this time. Now, obviously, we don't know, but Peepcorn was, throughout the 60s and early 70s, was fighting hard to keep the peace, to keep the two sides from hating each other. And most people on both sides kind of agree that his heart attack was because of the stress of the situation and people not dealing with it the way he, rightly so, thought it should have been dealt with. Interestingly enough, Peepcorn is kind of claimed by both sides. He was an extremely well-respected man. We still have, I say we, Concordia Seminary still has Peepcorn's cope, which is a liturgical cape, which we don't have. But it's like there's a stole. Peepcorn had a golden cope, which is a cape that we still have. It was used a couple times while I was there. Everyone was going, "That's Peepcorn's," right? Investment sort of thing. But he would hold like all-day vigils at some of the churches around praying for peace and like to keep the peace. And he was urging these various boards to actually talk to each other. And like I said, he was trying to keep the peace. He dies of a heart attack in 1973, in the fall of 1973. That's why teaching suspension was delayed. Partly because Peepcorn was on various boards that kind of required his vote. So part of it was they needed to fill his position, but it was mostly due to, it was like a time of respect and mourning for this individual. And then, as they say, after that time of mourning was over, everything hit the fan. So in January of 1974, teaching was suspended. Teaching was suspended, but I don't think he actually stopped working until February because nothing ever goes quickly. But January 1974 is when the suspension went into effect. We'll pause here because this is like our last pause moment for any questions that I can maybe answer.
We joined the church in Indianapolis in '66. And there was something going on. I never was really sure what it was, but they had sort of split.
Yeah.
And was that because of this?
I don't know. It's likely that this was involved. Churches leave the LCMS, not all the time, but from time to time for all sorts of reasons. But if they left in the 60s.
Well, the church we belonged to was LCMS, but they had a group that had splintered off, and nobody ever they never really said why.
They weren't talking about it.
Yeah, they didn't really say why, and there were a couple pastors that I talked to later that had left at that time. So were pastors leaving after this?
That would have been early, but yeah, probably.
But this might have been later that they were leaving.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And, well, we'll pause on this comment I'm going to make about pastors leaving until after.
They joined in then with the ELCA and went.
So yeah, that's definitely, this conflict is definitely why they were leaving. It'll be foreshadowing. There are a number of pastors, students, whatever you want to say, that left for political reasons, not for theological reasons. That basically said everything we just talked about was just wrong. How the synod handled it. You know how I mentioned synodical oversight and how a lot of these guys don't like it? That is it. What we just talked about is why they don't like it. And so there, especially early on, there were quite a few pastors that left because they did not approve of what Synod was doing and how they did it. They agreed theologically with Synod, but they didn't agree with how.
Well, I just looked up John teaching on Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
It said that following January 74, teaching and many of his supporters left the LCMS to form the more liberal AELC.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And so anyway, there were people in churches leaving at that point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, in response to Teachin being ousted from, Teachin suspension, the faculty and the student body of Concordia Seminary staged what is known as the walkout. The walkout occurred on February 19th of 1974. And in it, I don't know the percentages because I couldn't find my tablet that had my notes from seminary, but a overwhelming majority of students, upper 80s, low 90% of the students, and the number that's in my brain is all but 5 of the faculty walked out. I don't know if 5 is the exact number, but it's very close to that. It is single digits.
How many faculty were there?
Probably 40 or so. It was somewhere in that range, 40, 50.
So my brother was at seminary that year.
Oh, was he?
Yeah. He was one of the ones that stayed.
Oh, all right. The professor who was teaching me was also one who stayed. He said, well, this is what I saw while I was sitting in my dorm. And, well, we're going to show you. He said, I watched that happen from my dorm. He said, I think you can see me if this weren't so blurry, right, if you look. But the chaplain at the seminary, at least when I was there, I don't know if he still is, and for the life of me, I can't remember his name. He was on vicarage this year, and we'll get to this in just a moment. He didn't know where he was coming back. He didn't know which seminary he was going to. So in 1974, the vast majority of students and the vast majority of the faculty, in protest, walked off campus to form what they called the Seminary in Exile, or Seminex, as you'll often hear it called, on the campus of Eden Seminary, which is connected to Washington University. During the walkout, crosses, like you would see in a military graveyard, were nailed into the ground to signify the death of the students to the Synod. So we're dead to you, sort of thing. And the archway of the CFW Walther Arch was boarded up. And in fact, look at this multimedia presentation. We have pictures of both of those. So that is the door to the dining hall of the seminary. Well, let's see if I can zoom in for our folks on the line.
So it's Exile?
Yes. So that's the CFW Walther Archway. It's just plywood that they attached up there, and then they spray painted Exile over it after they all walked out. And that's one of the students nailing these grave-style crosses into the ground. It was an extremely dramatic moment. In addition to this, before the walkout, this was planned. Before the walkout, the media was invited so that they could film the dramatic walkout, and it aired on national news, which, yeah. Oh, I forgot to check the volume. Look at that. That's me not getting ready this time. Well, that's 100. That's probably loud enough. Now, so a news clip from the 70s, so the sound quality is awful, but.
1. To declare a moratorium on all classes until such time as the Seminary Board of Control officially and publicly declares which members of the faculty, if any, are to be considered as false teachers, and what scriptural and confessional principles, if any, have been violated. 2. To suspend our class hours until the Seminary Board of Control informs us of its decisions communicating to the Board of Control and to the Synod at large what we have been taught at this seminary, especially the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ.
No, that's one of the students.
And as we look back to that mighty fortress, we know these words are true. But we also know that there was one who went outside the camp. You are going out in order to speak the truth. That truth includes what you know about Concordia Seminary and the events that have taken place here. But that truth is much more than that. It is the truth with a capital T. The truth of...
At least I was able to pick up here and there in this meeting this morning is that emotions are running pretty high among the students. Is that a danger, do you think, this becoming overly emotional?
Becoming overly emotional is a danger. I think that people are recognizing how serious things are, and in that sense, I think at this point it's also in our favor.
What are you waiting for? Do you have any idea of how long this might last?
I guess I'm waiting for that ultimate confrontation when we will have to either recognize the new president of this institution and go back to classes or refuse to do that.
Any indication which way that might go at this point?
I can only speak for myself, and I know I'm still wrestling with it inside. Exactly what the circumstances are under which I'll have to make that decision has something to do with that. For the others, I just can't say. I'll have to let them speak for themselves.
I feel like you've already made it.
AG1 by Athletic Greens is so much more than a greens card.
What are functional mushrooms? What are non-functional mushrooms?
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, there are all sorts of documentaries on this. I mean, there are plenty of videos. I mean, like I said, that was national news. Is what you saw.
So I was at the University of Nebraska, and some seminary student came and talked to the student group. They went around to all the different student unions. I don't think it had any effect. I think they just thought, like, wow, this is really weird. And everybody went about their business.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up. So there was an offhand reference, at least as far as an outsider not knowing what's going on, to as you go out from here, you are proclaiming the truth with a capital T. In the months following 7X, or the walkout, one of the things that the students did is they paired up in 2s and 3s, got in their cars, and went across the country to all of the churches to tell their side of the story. This is what's going on from our perspective, right? You've heard what the Synod has to say. This is what we're saying.
So they did that, but I don't think they got any traction at all.
I know that there was some success. I don't know how widespread.
So I'm kind of clueless. I got to admit that, but I didn't pick up that.
I don't think it was hugely successful, but and there are newsreels of the cars speeding away from seminary.
So they were okay. So the schism was they were mad about the secrecy of the.
So it depends.
The idea was the information committee.
The fact finding.
The fact finding. They were mad that kind of like fishy behavior was going on.
That was a big part of it for a lot of the students, not for all of them. There were faculty teaching higher critical. When the faculty was condemned, it was a rightful condemnation for some of them, not for all of them, but the mass of the walkout came in reaction to how it was handled over the next years. So the chaplain that I mentioned, who was on his way back, and he said, I don't know what seminary I'm going to. I don't know if I'm going to Concordia Seminary or Seminary in Exile. He went to Seminary in Exile. Because he said, I didn't like the way Synod handled things. And so I went there. And within the next 3 or 4 years, he's like, well, I don't like what's going on in here. And he came back to the LCMS. So that there were people who didn't know where they were going to land on this sort of thing.
I'm
So they
so
were
confused,
bouncing.
like what they were arguing about.
I should have brought this up. So if we're going to boil it down to one little phrase, the contention was, is the Bible the Word of God, or does the Bible contain the Word of God? Which is it sounds like a fine line. So the confessional side says, the Bible is the Word of God, inspired and inerrant.
And those are the ones that stayed.
Yes. The ones that left were the teachers were, and some of the students, the theological walkouts, if you will, as opposed to the political walkouts. The ones that were leaving because they didn't like the situation. The ones that were leaving because of what they believed were leaving because they said, well, the Bible contains the Word of God, but it's not all the Word of God. It's not inspired and inerrant. Well, it's inspired, but only parts of it are inspired. And it's not inerrant.
So they're trying to cherry pick it.
Basically, yeah.
So what did they end up calling themselves, the people that left this in exile?
Well, so Seminex, they called the seminary in exile. Eventually, they become. Well, here I'll just read my concluding paragraph here. So over the coming years, pastors, students, congregations, and members would draw lines in the sand and choose their side before the rift in the LCMS became official in 1976 with the founding of the AELC, or the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, which is the group that would become the ELCA. They merged with a few other Lutheran denominations, where they have that name, and then some other things happened. And when I say the split became official in 1976, it was official in large part earlier than that, but there wasn't an official new denomination or new synodical group until 1976.
And I think it's fair to say that all the mainstream Christian denominations went through this.
Oh yeah, and are still going through it a lot.
They went through it like Methodist, Presbyterian, everything, but I think LCMS is the only one that sided on the conservative side. I think almost all the others became liberal.
Yeah, I think in large part that, and certainly the major groups.
Well, that's what attracted me to the LCMS.
And I mean, if you pay attention to the way the LCMS markets itself, it has a lot to do with that. Is we are a conservative, confessional church body. And that's this guy who's upset in Oklahoma. Oftentimes in his tweets, he would say, "Aren't we the conservative?" He would appeal to this, whether he knew exactly what he was appealing to or not. Probably does to some extent, but he is appealing to this culture that we still have. For what it's worth, the walkout was very dramatic. They walked all the way down to Washi, which is a couple miles down the road, and then, in very dramatic fashion, they did not come back to get their stuff. They came back for lunch, and then they lived in their dorms for the rest of the semester. So they left, and then a few hours later they did come back. And that was what Synod said, is you're just a bunch of kids throwing a tantrum. You don't really mean any of this, right? Which was probably not the line to take. But no, I mean, it is somewhat humorous, right? You had this great big, and the professor that I had, he said that. He said he was sitting in an empty dining hall with like 12 other guys, and they were eating, and they're saying, well, kind of, this is weird, and then everyone else just came back and had lunch with them. And then they're like, didn't we just like nail crosses with our names in the, right? I mean, but it was practical. You have a couple hundred guys who have nowhere to live. Like that's their house, is these dorms, and so kind of had to come back in large part. But they did not. The moratorium on classes began. That was pretty much it for classes.
What does moratorium mean?
Don't do it.
Okay.
Kind of like a strike on classes. So classes did eventually resume in the next academic year, although Concordia Seminary was out of professors. They were pulling anyone that they could find to teach at the seminary. I remember I'm related to someone fairly distantly, but who I spoke to when I was at the seminary, who was a professor at the seminary. The next year, he was a Greek professor, and he said, I barely knew Greek, but they needed a warm body in the front of a classroom to go over the alphabet with these guys. And he's like, I could do that. It took a long time for the seminary to rebuild its faculty. Again, you got the rough, vague numbers. Let's say you have a faculty of 50 professors and 45 of them leave. There aren't just 45 more professors just sitting around waiting. And a lot of them are probably going to say, I saw what you did to the last group of guys who were in there. I don't want anything to do with that, regardless of their position. So the seminary really did struggle to fill faculty positions for a while. I mean, we have certainly recovered from that by now. The faculty at the seminary is extremely robust. But you do still have people who the emotions that happen because of this, it does still spark up. Every once in a while, you'll hear Pastor Jordan or I, because Pastor Jordan went to Fort Wayne, the other seminary, the conservative seminary, right? At that point, it very much was. He and I make jokes about how our seminary is the best. Or I usually say, well, I went to St. Louis, which was the best seminary, and he said, well, I went to Fort Wayne, the conservative and professional seminary. Right? It's all in good fun.
What in Fort Wayne? Did they exist at the time?
Yes, they did.
What did they think about this?
They were not happy. Oh, I mean, we'll put it this way, and we are over our time. When I was there, and it was probably poor planning, when I was a second-year student, the chapel service when the student leadership from Fort Wayne came to visit St. Louis, we decided to have bongos in church. Honestly, it was absolutely beautiful. Katie's making a face. Everyone who's been in the Lutheran church for a while knows, like, right? It was absolutely beautiful. It was done during a chanting of the psalm. We had a soloist who I knew personally. He was a phenomenal singer. I'm not going to say his name because some drama happened. But it was beautifully done. It was bongos. And so...
Bongo drums?
Yeah.
I thought you said...
Which, doing that while the Fort Wayne guys were there for chapel is probably not the best idea. What was a really bad idea is they posted this on the Facebook, a video of it. And again, it was beautiful. It was a wonderful scene. I remember being there thinking, wow, this is really good, because not all the music at seminary is good. That one really was. Within 24 hours, there were 800 comments on that video of mostly pastors who were alive at this time. It started with all the Fort Wayne guys saying, there goes St. Louis. It's off again. A bunch of liberals there ruining chapel services. Just wait for the next walkout, right? And then those guys from St. Louis kind of saying, well, we don't like you. You're awful people too. And then the next day there were another 800 comments, most of which, to be fair, and I'm going to plant this flag, were current students from seminary or from St. Louis and Fort Wayne saying, guys, remember this 8th commandment thing? Y'all need to chill. We're good with each other now. Like, this isn't the 70s. We don't hate each other anymore. But I mean, these guys really did. And then the next day, the seminary, after like 1,600 comments and like actual Facebook fights, finally removed the video. Well, all of the students at St. Louis are like, guys, get rid of this thing. It's great, it's wonderful, it is causing problems. Like, you need to take this thing down. It was bad. So there's still bad blood. The bad blood is mostly from people who were alive at the time. And have
so you just have to wait for them to die.
Well, I mean,
so those Seminary pastors, that people had really graduated from there, so they had trouble getting calls.
Yeah.
Right. So many of them went to the Methodist Church.
Right.
But my brother he just retired, was pastor at the Evergreen District, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. which is very liberal. And many of the Seminary pastors got calls up there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was a really messy time. Like, we glazed over a lot, and we skipped over. This really isn't the end of the story. It's just kind of where we're stopping. We're all, like I said, we're already over time quite a bit here. I have one last note, and that is in the year 1968, a small group of people started a new Lutheran congregation in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, what is now known as Rivercliff Lutheran Church. By the way, I copied and pasted that off of our website. That's
You don't have to out yourself.
it's on our About Us. Oh, that's on our About Us page, right? So,
Once more, would you- I was-
1968.
I didn't hear it all.
1968.
Just read it
I want you
again.
to read that, what you said, I didn't get it all.
Oh, in 1968, a small group of people started a new Lutheran congregation in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, what is now known as Rivercliff Lutheran Church.
Yeah, some of the first organizational meetings, I think, were held up in the bank of North Georgia building.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because the cornerstone right here was laid in 1970.
Yes.
And that's what I was just going to ask.
Yeah, so
Where were they meeting? Because this wasn't built yet.
this is an enormous amount of, talk about living history. I mean,
And the Senate had already arranged to purchase this land before there was a congregation.
oh, really?
That's what
I think I'd heard that.
Yeah, Bill Hart said that they went around and found people, including him, that said, we've got a piece of land here that would be good for you guys.
Now, I will say, what a year to found the seminary, right? 1969, Teachin was elected as president of the seminary, so in 1 year.
Woodstock.
Yeah.
Moonwalk.
So,
What
any
was
final
walking?
questions? Like I said, we are over time, but
Oh, that was great.
hopefully, yeah. All right, well then let's close with the Lord's Prayer. We can put a conclusion on this entire course. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Last chance, turn in requests for classes in our next academic year. I've already got some of it loosely planned out, so this is, if you're waiting for the 11th hour to give me ideas, for me, now is the 11th hour. I like to get stuff on the books nice and early.
I would like to learn everything.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to turn the recording off before I tell you any of my ideas. Not because I don't want to tell the two of you, but because just in case I dramatically change my mind. I don't